Okay, welcome to a very, very important session of Art 2.1. This is the point in the semester when I go over all 9 elements of composition. And I'm going to go ahead and go right away to the speaker view. So you can see behind my head, I have put my whiteboard to good use. And at this point, it says it's recording, but I don't know why that's there. I want to get rid of that. Hi, hi, Colin. Um, Surely I can hide this because that's covering the top of the whiteboard. I spent quite a bit of time doing this the first semester I taught this as a Zoom class. In live classrooms, I write on the whiteboard in the classroom, of course. This is my um, Mickey Mouse. My dad used to say he was a pretty good artist, but he'd call this kind of work Mickey Mouse. Not having to do with anything to do with Disney products, but just not high end, but it's adequate to get across each of the 9 elements. And I will not only point to any relevant, not all of them can be described with drawings, but those that can, you'll see. And I will step out of the camera's eye, and I have a pointer, and I will do some adjusting if need be. But I've already moved around the objects. You're now seeing me with the camera, right? The laptop camera facing the opposite direction in my bedroom because there's only one place this can hang, and it's right there in this space, exactly the right amount of space between the two walls. So this works pretty well. Most students have told me they've been able to get a good overall, if they didn't already by now, from just the lectures I give them, your indication of how you can recognize each of the 9 elements when you're writing a paper. If for an A, you are required to describe where you see examples of each of those. Now, the lighting is terrible. It's even worse than usual. See, that's worse. I look like Bela Lugosi in the original Dracula, the black and white 1930s, right after the original Frankenstein. Anyway, there's not much I can do about the lighting. It is what it is. But as in what's important, it's that you can see the board. Now, there's a slight reflection because my curtains are closed all the way, but there's a, kind of a reflecting off of reflecting surfaces on my other wall. So that little line that's there is, it shouldn't disturb you. It's just a little bit of sunlight creeping through one end of my curtains. Okay, so if you don't already have it out with you now, you should be taking out this handout so we can go over it one item at a time together. And you can ask any questions you may have. And please do, I encourage that because that's what we're here for now. If about any of these elements as we go through each one, if there's anything that's not clear, or you can think of any other examples that aren't already on the board I just drew. Okay, so we're going to follow along here with the different types of elements as to whether something is stable or dynamic. Okay, we've kind of already covered that, right? Which is whether there is the presence. I'll go ahead and read you the definitions. You have them here, of course, and you should have this with you. I said this, I think, at least once. When you're working your paper, I would have it with you, and certainly before you finish the draft that you want to submit. As a checklist, I would go down this list and see, did I cover each of these elements? Okay, and if you didn't, then you want to deal with that. Okay, and add that in, because it's an easy way to avoid missing something which already would lower your grade before either I or the readers even start to grade your papers. So I would make this a kind of a checklist. Okay, the order in which this is not necessarily the exact order up there. I've always said this, I reserve the right to make minor adjustments within any one topic. So we'll do them in the order they're on the handout, okay, which you should all be looking at in front of you. All right, so the first element, dynamic versus stable. In order to determine if a work of art is either dynamic, stable, or most works are a combination of both, here's what you do. You look for the presence of 2 or more diagonal and or curve lines, and that makes something dynamic. We've covered several examples, so by now I'm guessing you at least have some familiarity with this element. and would be able to recognize it. The opposite, of course, again, of dynamic is stable. So when you see the use of straight lines or right angles in a work of art or any part of a work of art, that makes that area of that painting, drawing, building, sculpture, whatever, this applies to all the visual arts. That makes that area or that whole object, if there's only straight lines in it or right angles, stable. The opposite of dynamic. I think that's pretty straightforward and self-explanatory, but does anybody have any questions before we move on to the next element? Okay, let's do balance. And this is where I'll get up and do a little mini demonstration. Balance is where you, again, you look at the work of art and ask yourself, are there equal or roughly equal areas of objects from the top to the bottom and from the left to the right in a work of art? Well, there's really only one way to do that, and here's where I'll now stand up and begin doing my little demo explanations. Hopefully you can all see without my having to get my head into the picture. Here's the way that should be done, okay? About the only way you can be sure that you're correctly analyzing balance. Imagine that there's a grid around the entire work of art. It doesn't matter what it is, just in your mind, you imagine there's a grid pattern. Of course, if it's a painting, it already has that. It's called the frame, right? But with other works besides painting, whether it's sculpture or building and anything in real space or another kind of two-dimensional work of art, a photograph, whatever, you would then imagine that you had a grid pattern, an outline around the outer edge, and then divide that in, again, of course, in your mind, into 4 equal parts. So you've got quadrants. That's the right word for that. All of this is in detail, described in detail in Sarah Gill's book. So let's see. I think I'm out of the field of vision for everybody. So let's look at this. Are there equal objects in this? Let's say these are, comets, right? Or they could be jellyfish, which whatever you prefer. But they're objects streaking from, one end to from right to left across this. We'll call it a painting. Okay. So how can you tell if this is balanced? Well, let's take a look at each of the 2 aspects, top to bottom and left to right. So let's see, we have equal areas of objects in the top. Well, 1, 2, 3. And is that equal with the bottom area? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so that should be pretty obvious, but I do ask you to participate a little bit at this point with some of these examples. Would you say that this work of art, if this is what you were writing about, is balanced top to bottom or unbalanced?
Unbalanced.
Yeah, towards the bottom, right. I think you guys get the idea because we have started doing this already for the first 2 lectures or weeks. So what you have is more objects in the bottom. So by definition, it can't be balanced top to bottom. And then the same is true left to right at this point, right? Which way is it unbalanced? So you see, you need to not only say whether something is balanced or unbalanced, but in what way? In other words, left to right or top to bottom. So is this balanced? We know it's unbalanced toward the bottom, but it's unbalanced left to right. How would you describe that in 1 sentence? It's unbalanced towards which direction? Anybody?
Towards the left.
No, it's heavier towards the right. So you would say it's weighted. This is important. That's why we're doing this, because you haven't written these things before. So now's a good time to, of course, this is being recorded, so it'll be posted on YouTube. It took me a while. I apologize to get all the postings done over the past week class because on Friday, I thought my toe was infected. I only mention that because that's not an excuse that you'll hear it ever again. Things are fine now, and that won't happen. I usually get my lectures for that week posted for all 3 of my, well, actually it's only 2 online sections by 8 p.m. Friday, but this was an exception. So hopefully if you looked on Friday, you didn't see last week's lectures, go back and you'll see them in my YouTube channel. This one will be posted by 8 p.m. Friday, so you can review it. All right, so you would say it this way. Here we go. This work of art is unbalanced or weighted toward the bottom because there are more objects below on the bottom half than the top. And it is also unbalanced towards the right because there are more objects on the right half than the left. That's how you would say it. So you need to, in other words, give usually 2 sentences. This is a good rule of thumb to make note of, maybe write down or hear me now and remember me later, as I used to say on Saturday Night Live, which is that in order to get an A on either your papers or get a really full credit on your essay questions on the midterm or final, you need to have usually at least 1 long sentence with 2 examples or 2, in other words, 2 examples or 2 points you're explaining. And this, I just did that again, right? Because we just said the 2 points are whether is it balanced top to bottom? No. So I would do it separate sentences. Say the first sentence is this work is unbalanced toward the bottom because there are more whatever comets or jellyfish on the bottom half. Second sentence, it is also unbalanced toward the right because there are more objects on the right half. It's pretty straightforward. Now let's see if we altered it, whether it might be balanced. So in order to do that, I have to hold it so it doesn't wobble too much. Let's try this. It usually works pretty well, but you have to go slow. Now, is it any more balanced or a balance at all, either way, top to bottom? And if so, if it's not balanced, how would you describe that if it's unbalanced? How about top to bottom? It's unbalanced towards which, the top or the bottom? I think
the top. There's more objects.
You guys get the idea. I don't but I do show you one example where it is balanced. Yeah, that's exactly right. You'd say there are more objects above the middle than below. And then the same is true for it being unbalanced toward the right because of the number of objects. So to make it balanced, you can guess a very simple adjustment would then make this whole thing balanced. All right, so we'll leave it at that. Now it's balanced top to bottom and left to right because there are equal numbers of objects in the bottom and the top half, and there are equal objects, whatever they are, you would say what those are, jellyfish, whatever, equal numbers of jellyfish on the left and right. I think you get the basic idea. So I think that shouldn't bear too much further explanation. But do we have any questions at all at this point? Okay, I'm going to sit down again until we get to some of the other elements. All right, so let's talk about rhythm. And of course, these definitions are just verbal. So I always give you when it, I'm not going to be able to draw a whole bunch of examples of rhythm. We'd be here forever and my artwork wouldn't be that effective anyway. So I'll just give you verbal examples. Okay, so we're on number 3. A rhythm is the presence of 2 or more repeated or similar shapes in any work of art. We're not talking about musical or rhythm relating to sound. We're talking about visual rhythms in visual arts. So again, the presence of 2 or more repeated or even similar shapes creates rhythm. For all human portraits, unless somebody was, badly tortured or something and everything that was normally on their face was altered, if they're an intact human being with a normal human face, you're going to have rhythm. It's a given. Almost always, right? 2 eyes, 2 lips, 2 ears, and whatever else is visible. Nostrils, even perhaps, or bangs with people with long hair that's visible in a portrait or painting or photo of a person. The same is true for full-length portraits of a person, where you have their whole body. Because again, assuming the person has an intact body, they're going to have 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 hands, 2 feet, supposedly at every. And then finally, taking that analogy a step further to group portraits, again, it's a given that a group of people. Now you might say, wait a minute, people aren't always the same height, size, width, weight, what have you. That's true. But human bodies have certain basic common elements. Again, if they're intact, if there's a group of, let's say 6 people in a painting, a group scene, well, then there's going to be, repeated shapes of heads, arms, hands, and legs between each of the human figures. Even if some of them are children, right? and some are tall and some are thin and some are, heavy and some are not, it still qualifies as rhythm. Now, landscapes takes a little more analysis, but that's also pretty much of a given, where any landscape that's going to show you more than one of the same object, like two trees, right? Two rocks, a road with, different branches, two houses, right? Mountains in the background. Those can be considered shapes that create rhythm if they're roughly equal. I mean, it doesn't have to be identical. When it's identical, it's easy. Then there's rhythm. So, because even with an abstract painting, some of you may write about Picasso or some later even abstract painters where there's nothing recognizable from real life. There's just shapes and colors and lines, but that still creates rhythm. If there's similar shapes, similar uses of the same or nearly the same color or lines, that still would qualify as rhythm. Again, this one, I think it's pretty straightforward. Usually people know visual rhythm when they see it after hearing this definition. But are there any questions from anybody? Oh, Elijah, yeah. Elijah, we're doing the 9 elements and we're already on number 3, but this will be posted. Okay. I actually don't mute my students, so I don't know why some students, they look like it's self-muting, right? That's up to you guys. I definitely don't set the mute for any of my lectures because I don't think that's a good way to encourage participation or allow people to ask questions. So please speak up or do your raised hand thing or the chat, whatever, at the bottom of the screen if you have questions as we go along. Okay, so all right, so the best I can say with this is that rhythm, it's pretty obvious when you see it. I mean, there are places where it's not completely clear because the objects are similar. Maybe there's a bunch of different boulders in the foreground of, some town or countryside a painting of, an outdoor scene or a room where the furniture isn't all the same. But what about the windows? If there's even 2 or more windows that are almost the same shape, even if they're a different size, use your judgment when it's not 100% obvious, and you will get credit if you explain yourself. That's the key to all these elements and getting an A on your papers and in the essay parts of the 2 exams is just give examples. 2 is really a good number to come up with, because then you make it clear why you think something is stable or not. It's unstable, why you think it's dynamic, or why you think it's stable, or why you think
so. What about wheat fields and cypress trees?
Yeah, the rhythm was on the wheat itself in the foreground, and it was on, did we cover that? I can't remember now because I have 3 lectures back to back where I use different examples. You're going to double check. Flip back to the first page of my own syllabus here, because I teach 1.1 and 2.1, and there's slight differences. So let me just double check. Didn't we cover that? Yeah, we did. The first day of class. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, it was more specifically that that the not the like, okay, so we know that the shapes aren't the same, but I mean kind of the background mountains, how it's like the same kind of like half or quarter circle. Would that count as rhythm?
Yes, I would say qualifies rhythm, and I give you guys flexibility is the point in terms of how you interpret whether an object is similar enough to be qualified as an example of rhythm. Like I said, with human bodies, you can have a crowd scene, and there's just so many different types of human bodies that you might think, well, there's no 2 exactly alike, so there's no rhythm. Well, that one I would say you'd get a few points off, because human bodies do have certain common features. But with certain kinds of paint, especially someone like Van Gogh, who didn't follow strict realistic rules of Renaissance painting, but he did have repeated shapes. And that's a good example. The wheat fields, right? Remember, we saw that in the foreground, you could actually see a little bit of each of the wheat stalks in the first part, the very bottom closest section of the painting. And then there's obviously the two cypress trees. They're the same, roughly the same shape. And then the mountains in the background. So yeah, you definitely, most of the paintings up through about early expressionism, or even expressionism, we don't get to that in this class, but you might write about early 1900s, Matisse, people like that, around 1900, 1910. Some of them started getting further away from realism, and yet they still had roughly similar shapes in their painting.
What about Francis Bacon, or whatever his name is? I'm going to do one of his pieces.
I'd have to look at each one. That's a good example where it might be a case where there isn't rhythm, but usually if there's some recognized, as I recall, he did some paintings of people that were well known, like the Pope or a couple like that. and they still had either two ears or two eyes, or somewhere in the painting there was more than one of the same shape. But you use your judgment. If it doesn't look similar enough to you, you say, to me, this doesn't seem to have rhythm because the shapes of this and that objects are not the same or not very close. You would get credit because you're explaining yourself. Okay, so one more thing. We're now 1/3 of the way through these, because we got Egyptian art, and that's a subject I know people will find fascinating. A lot of you in your mini bios have said that's the subject you're most interested in, and we're not going to rush through that. On Wednesday, you'll see my own slides of up close and personal, my own photos of the Great Pyramids, Cairo, and the inside of King Tut's tomb. That's what we'll finish with after we do all the must-knows. But we need to get still through the rest of this. So, okay, we move on now to line. Line is pretty straightforward. I'll go ahead and use my pointer, but I don't even have to stand up for this. There's really 3 ways line can be used, okay? As outline, it can either be bold or thin. Line can be bold, thick, right? That's how I drew that. It should look bolder than the line over there. Thin outline. In a lot of paintings, both are present, whereas Michelangelo almost always used exclusive bold lines on his human figures, or even his, holy figures like, saints and things, or God himself, on any kind of bodies. That's his technique. He almost always used bold outlines. But almost every other painting from the Middle Ages, Renaissance, all the way through to modern paintings, if there's multiple objects, some of them are likely to have bold outlines and some thin, but quite often certain painters only use thin outline on everything. They don't feel need. So use your judgment. You can tell the difference, I think, when you see thin and bold outlines mixed together in a painting. And all you have to do is give me 2 examples if there are both, and say, well, where's one example of bold outline and where's another object with the thin outline? That's one way line can be used, okay, as part of visual art. Another is as shading. So I do this kind of minimal example, which is just enough room to fit on this board. Cross hatching, it's called, when the lines overlap each other and they create shading. And that's a type of line, of course. That would be in a black and white work of art, right? An engraving, where there's actual hand-drawn lines that overlap and end up forming a kind of shading. And so that's line used as shading, which it can be in a black and white drawing, of course, like an engraving. The third way line can be used is carved. Carved line is used on sculpture, of course, statues like Michelangelo's David, which we are going to see, not in this class, sorry, tonight's class, we will be looking at that, but you've all seen photos of that huge 19-foot tall statue. Well, it's actually 17 feet, 16 and a half feet, plus the base, of 3 times life size, right, of David with his slingshot, standing nude, looking at Goliath in white marble. Okay, so that piece, of course, has line, but it's all carved, where the face, the details of the features of the face, the muscles, the fingernails, the toenails, all of which, is done with carved lines. So that's how line can be used in different ways to create the illusion of actual objects. It can be shaded, overlapping, cross hatching, it's called. It can be outlines, thin or bold, or it can be carved line. Now there is a kind of a gray area, and that's with architecture. So the best I can tell you with buildings are, it depends on the building. If the building has carved into it the name of the building or the person who built it, with their monumental egos, and we can all think of some people who do that, put their name on every building they ever paid to have built with 40-foot tall or 20-foot tall letters, then you would say that there is a line there done with what? It depends on how the line, the words or the letters were created. But some older buildings, you actually saw the designers carve the name of the building, at County Courthouse or something from 1890 or 1910. You know this, you've seen examples of it, at least on Netflix and Amazon and movies, and of course buildings in downtown Santa Rosa, Petaluma, or San Francisco. So carved line can exist in a building, but painted line is pretty rare. You don't usually see people, because it wouldn't stay, it would wash off in the weather. So usually there's not any line on a building that's carved unless the name of the building or some other, letters are carved in the exterior. But there is visual line. Visual line is when the edge of a building looks sharp because of the sun creating shadows at the corner. That's called visual line. I wouldn't worry yet about that. We're not going to see many examples until we get to Greek and Roman temples and stuff, but I will show you when we see some slides with that. Visual line is when in a building where there's no carved line, there's no painted line, or maybe a little bit of carved line, but mostly they're just the building itself and the corners of it are visible in that photo that you are looking at or writing about. You'd say, well, on the edges of the, the temple front, it's called a portico, we'll get to that later, or on the corners of whatever building it is you're choosing to write about, there is the effect of visual lines created by the sunlight, the sun and shadows. That's sort of a gray area, and yet lines are normally not ever drawn or painted on a building and occasionally carved. Okay, so that's what the fourth one here. Any questions about that at this point? All right, masses. Now this is where I've added a new illustration since last semester. Number 5. This one more people miss than anything else. They just don't think to add it to the 9 elements they were writing about in the formal analysis. Remember, this is what we're saying, that these 9 elements together comprise a complete formal analysis. That's what you have to do to get even a B. If you didn't do any formal analysis, you wouldn't be able to pass the course. So you do have to do it on your essays, questions on the exams, and on your papers. And if you do all 9, you have a good chance, if you take the time to show examples of where each of those elements are, of getting an A on whatever paper or essay you're writing. So let's talk about number 5. It's pretty straightforward. Masses, so we'll look at that here. I actually have it as number 6 on the list. Or volume. Some people use the word volume, but in this class and with Sarah Gill's book, which we use as the template for these terms, I would stick to masses. With masses, it's pretty straightforward. What are you looking for? You look for what are the largest objects or parts in a work of art. And all I require is that you identify the 3 largest masses in that work of art. Unless you're just writing about a single object, and that wouldn't be interesting enough to write a whole paper about, like a giant ball of stone in a garden or something, like some Renaissance landscaping had in Italy in the 1500s, but you're not likely to write about that. You're almost certainly going to write about something that has multiple objects in it, whether it's a painting, a photo, a drawing, or a sculpture. But what if it's a single human body? Then it's a single mass. That makes your job easier. You say this is a single mass, a life-size object, and whatever it is. If it's life-size, 6 feet tall, or smaller than life, maybe it's 3 feet tall. Then
wait, what if it's a triptych and they're all like similar sizes?
Well, the objects within each of the 3 panels will have variations, is what you'd want to write about. I know that could be more complicated because we've of course not got to triptychs in this class. That's for a 1.2 or 2.2, but it's a topic somebody's going to probably write about or something like that. You want to have that option. Famous Renaissance triptychs, okay, there are so many of them that were full of human figures and maybe holy figures, angels, God, Jesus, whatever, and then buildings, right? I mean, I'm visualizing, I think, the kind of thing you're bringing up. Well, then you just look for the largest single objects in each of the 3 panels. But I would give you a break and say, if that's going to take you too long, just analyze the central panel. It's always the central panel in a 3-part painting. That's what the triptych is, with 3 panels. That's important, where the main meaning is, the main message. So you could just stick to the middle panel, and then it should be easy to see what are the largest objects in that one panel, as shown on the paintings, in that painting. Hope that helps. Is that clear? These are important questions. That's what I encourage people to do. Okay, any other questions of masses? Oh, what about a single individual building? Okay, so that's where now I'll go ahead and stand up again and give you my little bit of from Mickey Mouse to King Kong. Okay, maybe get your attention. That is corny as it is. an example of how buildings have mass even when they're a single object. Let's take the Empire State Building, and some of you have seen, how many movies have there been? 5 versions. Isn't there one since Jack Black in 03 did of King Kong, right? How many versions are there of that movie? Still the best one's the original black and white, 1933, still the best. Anyway, so we know, some of you know, he climbed, giant, right? Gorilla climbs up the Empire State Building, ends up getting to the spire before he's killed by airplanes, right? Some of you know that movie, or at least you've heard of it. So let's say you were going to write about a still from that film. Well, you can, you know, that's a topic you can choose to write your papers about. A still image from a movie, it would qualify as a visual work of art that's susceptible to all these elements in analysis. So let's say you had a photo, right, as a still from a scene from, it doesn't matter which version of King Kong, and it's the Empire State Building with him at the top from a distance. How would you describe the masses? Well, with that, in the Empire State Building and almost all the skyscrapers in that period, we're talking about the 1930s, right? It was a new building then. Their style has a long, tall shaft. It's 80 stories tall on the Empire State Building. So that's clearly the largest mass in that object. The second largest mass is the base. I should have put numbers 1, 2, and 3 here, but you get the idea. So the base is like 20 stories, I believe, on the Empire State Building. I haven't been there in many years. So you'd say that would be the second largest mass. And then the third largest mass would be the spire. And if you wanted to go another step, you might say, you know, the next fourth largest mass, you'll have to do more than the top 3. The 3 largest ones would be King Kong himself, assuming he's not as tall as the mast, or spire is the right word, sorry, spire. All these older skyscrapers had, well, new ones do too. In fact, most of the ones, at least that I've seen in New York and Chicago for sure. So you just look at a building, in other words, when you're describing mass in a building and it's a single object, if it's a single lunkhead, is what I used to call that, straight rectangle with just glass and steel windows, I don't see why anybody would write a paper about a building like that. There's not much to look at or describe or analyze, not much meaning. But it's your choice. What do you want to write about? Then it'd be a single mass. Of course, if it's just a shaft, that's all there is. And the base is not any wider and it's not narrower at the top. It's just a rectangular glass and steel box. Well, then you've got an easier job. You just say there's a single mass on this building and it is whatever, 80 stories or whatever, 800 feet tall or something like that. But usually you're not going to write about things that simple. You're going to have some variety of sections within a building if you choose to write about architecture. And you can tell by looking which sections of that building are the largest. All you have to do is describe the 3 largest sections. Okay, so that's the 5th one. Any questions about that? All right, then textures. Now with textures, you have 2 main types of textures that you need to write about. And this takes a little more analysis than the first 3 or 4 of these elements. But you can see, if you look carefully, how textures in a 2-dimensional work of art, meaning a painting, a drawing, a photo, can be either simulated, where the artist uses color, line, right? And whatever material they're using, whatever type of paint or watercolor, right? They are creating the illusion of real textures. Of course, paintings, any realistic painting is by definition going to have simulated texture if it's a realistic painting as opposed to abstract. So obviously with something about a portrait of a human being, the simulated textures, you don't describe that there's paint because it's obvious the paint is the real texture. So ignore that and just describe the simulated textures. You'd say this painting has a realistic, and you do want to define them as, are they sharp? Or you can say realistic. Either word will do. If it's a Renaissance or any other type of realistic painting, let's take a portrait. We'll take Henry VIII. I happen to be watching a show some of you may have seen that. It was in the late aughts called The Tudors. It's really well done, filmed on location with an all-British cast. About Henry VIII and his monstrous treatment of one of his wives he didn't. The other 5, he was horrible. Anyway, the point is, in that context, there are paintings of him that they're all over. Every museum I've been to that has Renaissance paintings from Europe, including American and European museums, not just the English museums. He was really famous, probably the most famous monarch on earth at the time he was alive because of his outrageous behavior. So he's shown with his velvet gold lined robes and his, fur collars and his crown or cap, and then of course his heavy set, physique. So there's simulated textures up galore. I started to use a phrase I can't use, up the wazoo, my dad would say. In a painting of a person who's dressed with ornate attire, you're going to have simulated textures, so many of different ones. You don't have to go into more than 2 minimum, maybe 3 examples. So you'd say that this painting has realistic, if it's a Renaissance painting, that's a given, realistic or sharp. You can use either word, right? Simulated textures on the hair, the beard, the skin, and the clothing. That would be good enough to get all, credit for that part of it. But what other kind of textures can be used in a work of art? Well, they can be diffused, and that's with an I, not an E. Diffused or diffused means soft simulated textures, like an Impressionist painting. Almost all Impressionist paintings have an implied kind of, like there's a difference between how a tree in an Impressionist landscape and a person or a group of people standing in that area near the woods or near the trees. There's an implied difference of textures between the human bodies and their clothing and the landscape, the grass, the trees, or whatever it is that they're standing in. So you would have to say there are simulated textures or implied use of simulated textures, but they're soft and diffused. For example, on the trees or on the grass or on the people's bodies and clothing. So you can either have sharp or diffuse simulated textures. But there's a whole different category of textures, which is the real textures. And those textures are what you see in architecture. Most buildings are not using phony. Victorian houses did, actually. So you might be writing about a house from the 1800s where they paint the wood in the living room on the fireplace mantle to look like marble. Okay, that's simulated texture, yes, in a building, but that's not likely to be the topic many of you are going to write about. So with buildings, usually it's all real textures. So how do you describe them? You would say this building has several textures, all of which are whatever, smooth, or some are smooth and some are rough, and just give me 2 or 3 examples. You might say there's smooth glass, smooth metal, and rough concrete on the outside. And you don't have to describe both the interior and exterior. When you're writing about a building, I'll give you the choice. Do you want to analyze these elements on the exterior only or on the interior? If you choose to do both, that's great, because some people do, but you're not required to do that. It'd be like a double amount of work. So either take a photo of the interior and use it as your illustration and describe that, the textures in that, or just of one of the main rooms or interior spaces. And then again, look at that photo and describe the textures you see. Those on a building are real textures. But what about sculpture? Let's take David, right? We just talked about Michelangelo's 16.5-foot statue of David in white marble. Are the textures on that real or simulated on a piece of marble sculpture? Or anybody know? Because it's not either or. When you're looking at it, you can see that it's marble, right? Okay. Well, that's real, of course. This is real smooth marble. So you would have to say that to get full credit. And simulated texture, of course, on the hair, the skin, the fingernails, the toenails, which the artist used carved line to create. So you see how you need a couple sentences at least for each of these elements to get them thoroughly or carefully described, accurately described. But it doesn't take that much, a couple, 3 sentences. You see why it's a page is a minimum to get full points on your papers when it comes to each of the halves. For the formal analysis, to do all 9 elements, and you're going to have at least 2 examples, should be 2 different sentences for each of the 9 elements. It's easy going to be over a page and a half. Usually a page and a half to 2 is plenty for a good, thorough formal analysis if you cover all 9 elements. Okay, so again, textures can be mixed on a piece of sculpture where they're both the real material of whatever the sculptor used, whether it's wood or, what else would it be? Metal. Some people use metal, of course, for sculptures, or stone, whatever kind of stone. Is it a rough stone or smooth? And then the carved lines, if they are trying to make an object look like something else, that's the simulated texture. And with a building, it's usually only real texture. And with a painting or drawing, it's almost always simulated textures, unless it's an abstract painting or drawing. Okay, we've covered quite a bit. That's 2/3 of the way through. So let's take a quick pause. Any questions about the last element we covered, or examples of that, or any of the first 6? Okay, then let's go to modeling. This I've already drawn, and it's one of my more halfway competent circles. It's almost a real full circle. Modeling, let's again use our definition. Sorry, put it all the way over on the other surface here. So with modeling, which I have it down at the bottom here, but we're going to go through the order that is on the board because that makes it easier to follow. Modeling is the use of contrasting areas of light and dark or shading to create the illusion of a three-dimensional object. So with this one, I'll stand up again. You will notice that in this, giant globe, let's call it a piece of marble in a garden, in a Renaissance garden. There's lots of that kind of stuff all over Europe, especially Italy, where the Renaissance started. So they might have made, some kind of, it could even be a painting or drawing of such an object. The light, I put the arrow here, is the source of the light is, let's say it's coming from the lower right side of this object. That part of the object, if you're using this technique of modeling, will be bright or well lit. And then the shadows will be on the back half, the half that doesn't get the light hitting it. And that's why I did this. It's the cross hatching again, right? With my trusty marker here. So that would be the dark and contrasting areas with the light creating, hopefully, the illusion of a three-dimensional object. If it's done properly and carefully and professionally, it will look like it's a real three-dimensional, at least at a glance, right? In this case, a round object. But modeling also is susceptible to variations. Of course, artists can choose to make it sharp, or you could say realistic. Either word will do. Just like down here where the simulated texture. So modeling can be, strong. You could even say strong, sharp, or realistic. In this case, this object, this illustration would be an example of sharp or strong modeling. But it can also be soft or diffused. Remember, those two words are pretty much interchangeable, right? Strong or sharp, those are synonyms when it comes to analyzing techniques of art. Soft and diffused are also the same basic concept. They're synonyms. So if it's soft modeling, it's going to be probably like an impressionist or later on post-impressionist painting, where it's not super realistic, but you can still see some gradation or variations of light and color. Again, I think this one's a pretty straightforward one when you see it. But you have to decide whether you think the modeling, if you see any modeling, is sharp or realistic, or is it soft and diffused. In some paintings, there's both, of course. Okay, any questions on number 7? I'm going to sit down for number 8 because there's no way I have the skill to do a whole bunch of, in the time that we don't have, to do a whole bunch of different illustrations of all the different types of warm and cool colors. But let's do again. Sorry, I don't have the table I'm working at, doesn't have room enough to put papers down on. Okay, so let's just read that under color, number 8. And color in, again, visual arts now, is the use of warm colors or earth tones. And those I've listed the main ones right here in parentheses for you: red, yellow, orange, gold, brown, and pink, or any shades or combination of those colors. Things that come from the earth itself. We're not about on top of the earth, that would be grass and trees. That's not what we're talking about things that are in the earth, that originally came from the earth. And colors, paints, and things are made from objects that came from the earth at our feet. Of course, as some of you know from having experience of your own painting, watching my mother, describe what was in the paints that she used to have and why we shouldn't suck the paint tubes when we were little kids. That's how I learned that paints actually come from the earth, right? And objects in the earth. So earth tones or warm colors, red, yellow, orange, gold, brown, or pink, appear to advance towards the viewer when we see them. Okay, and I'm going to give you an example. It's going to require, oh, I forgot to bring, it's on the other wall. My wife has moved the illustration, but I've got it here for you. I'll go get it in just a second. So appears, why would an artist use warm colors? So they want you to notice those objects first, because it's an involuntary human reaction. Unless you don't have normal color vision, of course, that would be the exception. But anyone who does have normal color vision, your subconscious, your mind will notice the warm colors first. It's an automatic human response. So what are the opposite of warm colors? Cool tones: blue, green, gray, and white. They appear to recede from the viewer. So pardon me briefly disappearing from the screen while I get this illustration I have here next to this. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to hold this up and I hope it doesn't have a problem with reflection. Let's see. Well, it does. Let's see if I do it at a different angle. Maybe this. Got to be able to just see enough of it. You know what? I'm going to turn this out temporarily because I haven't done this in about 6 months. That's better. For this purpose, this is better. Okay. This is the cover of a magazine, or it's a reproduction, of course, of the cover of a magazine, which was during the pandemic of 1918, by the way, when people were, in pretty bad shape. It was worse than the current pandemic. I guess I can't get that reflection to go away. Oh, wait, that's good enough. See, House and Garden. It's actually a magazine that's still around today, I think. So what colors do your eyes notice first? Well, maybe nobody wants to volunteer, but your eyes, whether you consciously are aware of it or not, are going to pick up the reds and the yellows on the house itself that's in this. It's actual painting from the cover of a magazine, reproduced, of course, is a lithograph. Some of you know what I'm talking about. It's the technology they would have had back in 1918. So what you see here are the warm colors of yellow and even a little bit of brown around the door frame and windows, and the red roof first. That's what the artist wants you to notice first, okay? And then the cool colors of the blue sky with a little bit of white in the clouds and the different shades of green on the grass and trees are the cool colors that you notice after, or second, or secondarily, if you want to put it that way, after you notice the warm colors. It's no accident that the artist chose to portray what they wanted us to notice first in warm colors. Earth tones, which I've already listed what those are, and obviously yellow, brown, and red on the house are all warm or earth tones, whereas everything around it are cool tones. I think you get the idea. Okay, so I'm going to turn this on again because otherwise I think some of the other illustrations will show up as well. All right, so let's move it back to where you can see the whole board. Okay, so then we're looking at the next and last category, space, the final technique. Okay, it's not one technique, it's a category of techniques. It's the most complex. It'll take the most time for you to get right if you want to do it carefully in your papers. This you can't do in less than a paragraph. Unless you don't want an A, and if you don't mind that and you just want to pass with a, basic pass, not pass, that's fine. But if you want to get, a good grade and you want to learn how to do this for yourself for future classes or just your own interest, you want to actually stop and analyze whether or not the 6, and there are 6 major types. That's all we asked you to. There's more than this in the world. There's Chinese perspective. We don't get into that in this class. In the world art class, we do. So I'm just limited to the 6 most commonly used techniques for depicting depth or space. Either word will do, they're synonymous. To depict depth or space in a 2-dimensional work of art, you have 6 techniques that you would need to analyze or see if they're there. And in most works of art, not all 6 are used, very rarely. So now I'm going to have to stand up for this. Hang on. Okay, so we'll start with overlapping. I already mentioned this. We saw that with the cave paintings, right? Wasn't it last week? I think, yeah. Overlapping, I think, is self-explanatory, right? It's when you see one object overlapping another, and the object that is being overlapped is supposed to look further away from the viewer or be further away in that painting, drawing, or sculpture. Of course, this applies to any two-dimensional work of art, these 6 techniques. Register line is a very early technique that was found in ancient Egypt. We're going to see it in the very first slide, that we'll get that far today, at least maybe first two Egyptian slides before we finish today. And it only was used in the ancient world. You just don't see it much now. I mean, maybe some modern painters do, but I don't know of any that have. So it's more of a technique of the earliest ancient art, where the objects are drawn on lines, right? On horizontal lines, and you see those objects on the line that's lowest or below the others. That object or those objects on the lower lines are meant to look closer to the viewer, and those objects on the upper lines are supposed to look further away. It's a very simplistic technique for depicting distance or depth or space in a two-dimensional work of art. It's not very common. Very few slides in this class, you'll see a handful where that's visible. And it wasn't used much after ancient, even the Greeks didn't use it much, and the Romans never did. So anything after ancient Babylon and ancient Egypt, you're not likely to see that technique. But it is a technique that you occasionally will find. I guess some modern artists might decide to do it just to be different. So you see the lines, in other words, and the lines at the bottom or the lower part of the painting are the objects that are closer, whatever's on those lines, right? It's pretty, again, straightforward. Diminishing size is a kind of a variation of that, but you don't see any lines. So again, I pardon my Mickey Mouse stick figures, but it's the best I could do, where objects that are larger are supposed to be the ones closest to you, and those that are further away are shown as smaller. And you get the idea, progressively smaller as they're supposed to be receding in space. That's technique. Again, pretty obvious when you see it, is called diminishing size. Now, this is convenient timing for us because we just saw Stonehenge, remember last week. Foreshortening is the technique where, and I believe that I may have defined here, I'm not sure if I did. Some of them I put down. No, I only did the last two, yeah. As foreshortening is a very straightforward concept where objects that have foreshortening are depicted as the part closest to the viewer being wider and the part furthest away from the viewer being narrower. It's just how we perceive space in real life. It's how human eyesight perceives objects that recede away from us. Again, when you see it, it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty obvious. So take one of those giant stones. We saw slides, a bunch of them, right, last week, with some of the fallen stones that are on the ground from Stonehenge. And the photo, depending on which angle was taken at, was showing the whole object of one of those large 18 to 22 foot long pieces of stone falling down on the ground. You're going to see foreshortening because the part that's closest to the viewer will look wider and the part furthest away will be narrower. That's, of course, a technique used in drawing and painting as well as showing up in a photo of a real object. But all three, painting, drawing, photos are all two-dimensional works of art, and they are usually when objects are shown that are, long, right? Long enough. They're not just, a single square or circle or globe. Objects that are long, right? Enough to fade into the distance, you almost always are going to see that technique of foreshortening. A portrait of a person up close or a straight head-on view, like the ones I mentioned of Henry VIII, where he's just standing there looking at the painter, and there's nothing else shown behind him or around him, maybe just a wall. That there would be no foreshortening then. But if it was a group of people in a room and they were turned with their shoulders, some of them towards the painter, towards the viewer, I should say, then you might say there's foreshortening on the shoulders of some of the figures and say which ones. Okay, let's pause. Any questions about the first? These are the simplest techniques. It gets more complex as you get towards the last. Actually, we've already covered 4 of them. The last 2 techniques are the most sophisticated, and they were not developed until the Renaissance. But you don't have to know that fact because we're not covering Renaissance. But they weren't developed until a few hundred years ago. And they're the ones you're going to see the most often in a realistic painting or drawing. So let's do each one of these. I did define here on under number 7, but I'll make sure before we move. The first one we'll do atmospheric perspective. Make sure it's clear to you before we move on to the last one. Okay, so what is atmospheric perspective? It's a technique for depicting space in a 2-dimensional color, and that is the key, color only. It doesn't apply to black and white art. So again, atmospheric perspective is a technique in a 2-dimensional color work of art, comma, in which those objects farthest away from the viewer appear bluer and hazier than those objects closest to the viewer. It's pretty straightforward when you see it, but I'll say it again, slowly repeat that. So you should be writing some of these definitions just for future reference. Hopefully you can go back to these notes if you need to when you're writing your papers. So again, atmospheric perspective is a technique for depicting space in a 2-dimensional color work of art, comma, in which those objects farthest away from the viewer appear bluer and hazier than those objects closest to the viewer, period. The ancient Romans perfected this technique, so I shouldn't have said the Renaissance. They developed, they didn't exist before roughly the late ancient world, right? The Greeks, I don't think I've seen any evidence they used it. Definitely the Egyptians, the Babylonians did. So it's a technique that was perfected by the Romans and then forgotten, totally forgotten, lost because of the Dark Ages, right? The Middle Ages, people just got dumb and they forgot what they'd learned before. As you know, we're going to cover that period. And then the Renaissance comes along and they rediscovered atmospheric perspective. I'll give you one example every single one of you has seen, unless you've never driven south of Rohnert Park, okay? Everyone here has done this, I assume. In the daytime, the next time you drive south on 101 and you get to Cotati Grade, be careful and make sure that you don't veer into the lane of the car next to you, but once you know it's safe and you're near the top of Cotati Grade, look out towards the west, no matter what time of day, but especially it's noticeable in the afternoon, and you'll see exactly this technique. It's not a technique in real space, of course, it's an atmospheric effect. That's why we call it, of course, atmospheric perspective. You'll see that the hills and mountains, the further away they are from where you're looking, where you're driving, the bluer and hazier they are. It's just because of the way the atmosphere, conducts light. It's just a scientific fact. So again, assuming you have normal color vision, you'll see that effect if you haven't already noticed it. Okay, any questions on that one before we get to the last one? Scientific perspective, or any of the previous techniques for space. Okay, let's wrap it up with the most complex technique, and this one was not invented until the Renaissance, and that is scientific perspective. It's a technique, again, for depicting space in a 2-dimensional work of art, right? Where an artist draws diagonal lines onto the composition that all meet at a common vanishing point on the horizon. I didn't even label horizon. That should be obviously the parallel, horizontal line is the horizon. I'll say that again. It's a technique for depicting space in a 2-dimensional work of art, comma, in which the artist draws a series of diagonal lines onto the composition, which all meet at a common vanishing point on the horizon. It's the most accurate way to depict space the human race has ever developed in a 2-dimensional work of art. It didn't exist until the Italian Renaissance, but some people think that the Romans had figured the concept out without doing the actual technique. A lot of you, I know, have told me in your mini bios that you've taken drawing and painting classes where you probably practice this technique. I see students doing it in Annalee Hall. Even now with the pandemic, there are several in-person art drawing classes where perspective is taught. So a lot of you know this from your own experience. But if you don't, you do want to write that definitely well. It's actually printed out for you. But be clear on that one, because that almost always shows up in. Now, do you see the diagonal lines? Of course not. That would look amateurish. They're painted over after the artist draws them in chalk or pastels or even pencil or whatever, and then they paint the objects in, over the lines, which then actually, in a way, it's combining diminishing size, because these objects, let's say it's a group portrait, and the people are standing further and further away. Well, they're going to fade in size the closer they get, the further away they get, from the viewer. And of course, that is guided by these diagonal lines that all meet at a common vanishing point. Now, some of you know that a lot of realistic paintings, even in the early Renaissance, began using multi-point perspective. We'll go crazy if we try to get into everything at once. And others, sometimes they just used freehand. Van Gogh did that. He didn't. Well, he actually knew how to do scientific perspective. He'd studied it when he was a student. He was self-taught mostly, but he did have a mentor. I think it was his uncle, who showed him how to do some of these things. And so he could have, but he chose not to do the diagonal lines onto the composition, but he'd learned the concept. But with almost every other realistic style painting from early Renaissance, they didn't know it in the Middle Ages. The technique didn't exist. So the periods covering after this class, the era we cover here, ends in that early Renaissance, all the way up until most modern paintings that are realistic use this technique of scientific perspective if they want to have an accurate, realistic looking depiction of depth or space in a two-dimensional work of art, painting or drawing. But the only exception to this, or additional element for space, is real space. Of course, if it's architecture, there's no techniques for space. Buildings aren't techniques, they're actual structures. So in a building, you have to describe the dimensions, and you are, able to, everyone should be able to, whatever. If you're writing about architecture, pick a topic where you can find the dimensions, the width and height of the main rooms inside, or the exterior, if you're only writing about the exterior. For instance, the Empire State Building is, don't ask me why I know this, 1,250 feet tall. It was the tallest building in the world for about 40 years, beating out the Chrysler Building, which was just, I think, 30 feet shorter. So you would want to describe the height, and then, of course, the width, and then maybe at least one or two of the main spaces inside. If you're writing about architecture, you want to give the dimensions of at least the largest interior space, maybe two largest rooms, and then, or sections, and then the exterior dimensions. You should be able to find that on the internet about any famous building. If you don't know what they are, then you can approximate it if it's a building that doesn't have any history to it, but that's not likely to be what you would probably be writing about. So remember, with architecture, the use of space is real, and you describe the largest parts of the exterior and maybe the two largest interior spaces. We've covered everything, but I'm sure there's still things that aren't, this is early on, so don't be too worried about not having everything immediately clear. But are there any questions? Now's the time to ask about.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, you go first.
Yeah. Quinn, is that?
Okay, I'll go. I guess I'll go first. So I was kind of confused between let me see, number 3, which is diminishing size, and 4, which is foreshortening. So is diminishing size when they're kind of like stacked on top of each other, and then foreshortening is on like the one plane?
Yeah, when it's a single object. Any individual object can be susceptible to foreshortening if the artist is depicting it with, it's usually we're talking about long and narrow objects, Quinn, where, like I said, the fallen stones at Stonehenge would be a good example, or any building, like a street scene. A cityscape, they call those, where you see a street in a city or town or village. And foreshortening can be also true on landscapes where there are no buildings, where maybe a road, right? The road gets narrow as it goes further towards the horizon. That would be an example of foreshortening, or a very large boulder, that, is long enough that the back farthest away end of it from us is shown as narrower than the part closest. You can use your judgment. I want to emphasize that, if you see something slightly different, but foreshortening, more often than not, if the artist uses it, it's very obvious and very conscious. And whereas diminishing size is separate individual objects that don't, in each one of them, there's no foreshortening. The objects are just smaller and smaller the farther away they get. Like, again, if we're looking at a town or cityscape, a painting of a city, the houses or churches that are farthest away from us, closer to the, horizon, are going to be shown smaller And the ones closer, larger, that's diminishing size. Okay, now there was somebody else who was it? Sorry.
Hi, yeah, it's Nicole. I had a question about our paper. Could we send a rough draft of our
Yes.
formal analysis
Oh, I meant to tell you that.
approve and like
Oh, yes,
any tips?
yes. Thank you. Thank you. See, now you're helping me help you and help the other students. And I got to remind myself this evening's class, I should just put that up front. Yes, you can send me a rough draft, but don't wait till the night before it's due. Give me hopefully 72 hours or 48 at least, because then I can just, read it. Don't forget to send it though to, well, you could send to either one would work, the AOL account or the Outlook account, but as a PDF. So I can open it and tell you, okay, I see you've got X, Y, and Z, but you're missing, this and whatever, one or two items, and tell you if you need to add. Yes, you can, but just don't wait till 1 or 2 days before if you want to get a response in time to make those changes. Yes, all my classes, I give that option for each of the two papers. Hope that should help for many people. People that do that almost always get A's on their first or second paper. Okay, any other questions? Because I think the timing here, we might be able to do the first Egyptian. Let's try and do that. But I don't want to cut short any questions because this is equally important because it's for all the topics we're going to have for the whole semester, these techniques that you'll need to recognize when you see them so you can write about them. Anybody have any other urgent questions? Okay, then I'm going to need to bear with me. We might go to 418. Okay. Hang on. There's all kinds of imagery here that I don't need, but just the ones we're going to talk about are down at the bottom. There we go. We are going to do Egyptian art now. And we are going to start with, I'll go ahead and give you the title, The Palette of Narmer, Narmer, and that's this work right here. And of course, you can't see it yet, so hang on. All right, give me like 20 seconds or so to get to where we can do the screen share. Come on, disappear. Why is this not? Just get this out of here. Okay, there we go. Get it larger, and then let's make sure everybody can see it. You guys see this? Yes?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay, then let's do this. And that way we won't have to rush quite as much because I don't want to skip over any of these slides. On Wednesday, we'll do the rest of the Egyptian slide. The first one, this one's very, very important. I, again, give you guys a heads up. It has a high possibility of being on the midterm. Palette, P-A-L-E-T-T-E. Again, these words are on your syllabus, so if we stop and spell them all 2 or 3 times, we'll never get through the semester. Palette of Narmer, the name of the pharaoh that had it created is Narmer, N-A-R-M-E-R. Of course, it's Egypt. That's a given. All the slides this week's lecture are Egypt. To date, 3,150 or 3150 BC or BCE. A palette is a flat, portable piece of stone. This is not, I don't believe, a new definition. I don't think I added that to my list. No, it isn't. It isn't. So you don't have to worry about that. But you should know what things were invented by the Egyptians. And these could come up on the list. I'm going to give you, I think it's 2 definitions when we get next class on Wednesday to other works of Egyptian art. So there's no new definition for this slide, but a palette is just what you see. It's a flat piece of stone carved with a decoration, a scene of the history of that culture. But it's not going to appear as a definition, that word, on the midterm. The Egyptians invented frescoes, columns, you see that list, temples, pretty impressive list, flat-sided pyramids, obelisks, and some argue with number 6, written language. There's a debate. We'll get to that when we get further into the slides on Wednesday. Okay, so what is this? It's depicting the founding of the Old Kingdom. I think by now you should all have read your section of Stockstead on ancient Egypt, or even studied Egypt a little on your own. There were 3 major eras each one of which lasted several hundred years in ancient Egyptian history. The three main eras were the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and you guessed it, the New Kingdom. This is a scene, that depicts the founding of the Old Kingdom. The first time Egypt was unified. This is all part of the meaning. It's all pretty important because this all could be stuff you might be asked to remember from your notes, right? And not remember. You have them in front of you, hopefully, when this could appear on the midterm. So once again, it depicts the founding of the Old Kingdom when Egypt for the first time was unified under one pharaoh. Well, you can probably tell which guy is the pharaoh in this, and that would be Narmer, of course. I just said that's the pharaoh's name, the guy that created this work of art. Anybody tell which one is the pharaoh? Somebody there must. It's pretty obvious, but what is it that tells us which of these figures is the pharaoh?
The size.
Yes, excellent. The size, the largest figure in all ancient Egyptian art, the largest figure would be the pharaoh, assuming the pharaoh was depicted in that work of art. He would always be shown as the largest figure. Okay, so that's this guy. But since we're short on time, then he also has the royal headdress. My daughter, when she was little and she came to visit my class once, she said, that guy looks like he has a bowling pin on his head. Well, it does kind of. It's a leather headdress called field headdress, but you don't have to get that detailed. It's a royal headdress. Only the pharaoh, which is, the ancient Egyptian word for king, only the pharaoh would wear that. And he wore it when he was out in combat. He's in battle now. And finally, if that's not enough clues as to which one is the pharaoh, he's got a scepter, right? There's his scepter. Scepters are always a symbol. We already covered that last week with Hammurabi, remember, of the authority a king has to rule. Okay, so he's got three symbols marking him as the pharaoh Narmer. This guy here, so you can guess, and I'll just give it to you because we're short on time, is the defeated pharaoh. So what Narmer did was he was from northern Egypt. He invaded southern Egypt and he defeated the other pharaoh. And I don't remember his name. You don't have to. I don't even know if it's in stocks there. But this pharaoh here was the loser. You can say it that way. The one who then lost that battle and therefore his life. And if it's not obvious he lost his life, there is a scene depicting him a little after the battle, having had his head severed from his body. And he's just, being, of course, displayed as a humiliating gesture of defeat. And then this is Narmer. Narmer, pharaohs, not just Narmer, pharaohs in ancient Egyptian culture, the people believed, all of them supposedly, that pharaohs could change themselves into several kinds of animals, disguise, if you want to say themselves. Falcons, cobras, and vultures were the three main ones that Egyptian pharaohs were believed to have the power to change themselves. So that's Narmer there, the falcon, literally lording it over the severed head of his defeated enemy. Then we get to a controversy. This guy has been debated over for thousands of years. I've seen this piece. It's in the Cairo Museum, by the way, in Cairo. Is he a servant only bearing sandals for the pharaoh? I don't think so. Neither do the docents I talked to at the Cairo Museum. They said, wait a minute, he's got a pot of ink and he's following the pharaoh around recording these events. That would make him a scribe, right? S-C-R-I-B-E. Scribes are not lowly foot servants. So the other possible explanation, there's no certainty here. We don't have any written records as far back up there. Well, we do, but they're not in language, in written language. They're hieroglyphics, right? Or are they? Well, they say pictograms. That's the phrase most people use. These are illustrations that recorded history that makes this not prehistoric because they're recording their history. And it's a form of communication. It's just not in alphabet form. Ancient Egyptian language was, of course, recorded very thoroughly. You'll see examples with their version of an alphabet, but they hadn't have it this far back. So if those are not sandals, they could be both. It's possible, but it seems unlikely that a scribe was one of the highest ranking people in ancient Egypt. The pharaoh depended on the scribe to follow him everywhere during his waking hours, of course, especially in public, and record the events, what he said and what he did. the scenes that were, and then those would be turned into works of art, of course, just like what you see here is a work of art. Okay, so is he a scribe or a sandal bearer, or could he be both? If he's a scribe, my guess is that these are papyrus or scrolls, which would make more sense. But it is possible that he is somehow doing both, carrying sandals and a pot of ink as a scribe to record the events. No one knows for sure. And then we don't have to know every object. We'll never get through the course if we do that. But these are Taurus, obviously the sign Taurus. He was Taurus. He was born in the sign of Taurus. The back is very different. That shows him marching. There he is. Obviously, he's the tallest guy. He's the pharaoh, and his main general, plus that scribe slash sandal bearer, which however you want to write that, or you can say scribe and or sandal bearer, following behind the victorious pharaoh with his, again, that's his ceremonial headdress. You see how it's different than the leather one he had in combat. And then these are his troops, symbolizing, of course, he had more than 4 soldiers, his legions, or whatever you want to call them, his forces, who had won a victory over these poor guys. And if it's not obvious, whoops, sorry, I meant to get. These are the defeated soldiers of the losing pharaoh, and they've had their heads cut off and their heads stuffed between their legs. It's pretty gruesome, but that's exactly how losing armies were often. They had 2 choices: the humane choice, be sold into slavery; the harsher choice, executed right after the battle. So these ones were executed. I guess Narmer didn't have any sense of mercy on this battle, after this battle. Okay, and then finally, this is Egypt. These are the 2 halves of Egypt, and they are not giraffes. They are long-necked mythical creatures. Look carefully; those are not giraffes. But if you want to call them giraffes, I wouldn't necessarily take points off. But they are long-necked, or you could say giraffe-like, long-necked or mythical creatures, which are being controlled by his handlers. Of course, he appoints people to rule over all these new provinces. Right, northern and southern Egypt that's a huge area. Egypt's a very big country. It's like twice the size of Texas. I've been all over Egypt, so they would need local handlers, governors, how would you want to call them, regional rulers that he would appoint, and that's what these 2 guys are symbolic of. They are controlling Upper and Lower Egypt. These 2 creatures represent the 2 halves of the now unified kingdom of the first pharaoh to rule all of Egypt, northern and southern, to found the old kingdom. So that's the whole meaning. Let's do a form analysis and then call it. We'll do it quick. This has register line. There's no question that the pharaoh is closest to us and the scribe slash sandal bearer is further away. So there's only the 2 lines. That's not a line. That's some kind of a object, I don't know, to display the severed head of this guy here. But there are 2 horizontal lines, and one object, obviously the pharaoh was the closest to us, so he's on the lower line. So that's register line. And then another technique here is overlapping. I'm sorry, I almost misspoke. Overlapping, obviously, is always present in every 2-dimensional work of art. If there's more than one object and there's any distance being depicted, you're going to see some kind of overlapping. And this, of course, are the clothing overlaps his body, and you get the ideas. And then his fist overlaps the head of the defeated pharaoh. His legs overlap the losing pharaoh's legs. And then on the back, you can see 2 more register lines. The victory parade, I'll call it that, the celebration or victory parade, that's happening in the distance. Meanwhile, he's already got his governors, his local, handlers, going to work to control the people of those new provinces, so that those 2 guys and the symbolic creatures are supposed to be closer to us. So there's register line and overlapping here. It's a cool gray color. If it's on the exam, though, you're only going to have to analyze one side of it. So whoops, let's go back to the other view, because I think the more important is this one. The largest, that's easy. The largest mass is Narmer, and then the defeated pharaoh, and then it's a close call. The scribe maybe is the 3rd largest, or perhaps the falcon. You decide. The symmetric texture is excellent here on the pharaoh's skin and hair, his clothing, on the falcon's feathers. The beard, right, of even the severed head of the defeated pharaoh. And there's a lot of symmetric texture, and that's all done with carved line. And here the modeling is this created by the sun. This is a bas relief. Remember that term, we discussed it last week. That'll come up definitely on the midterm. It's a bas-relief, and you can't see the figures in a bas-relief if it weren't for the modeling. Of course, the raised figures have shadows created by, in this case, the museum, not an artificial lighting for the museum. If it was outdoors, it would be the sun creating the modeling. Okay, it is almost entirely stable. The only thing dynamic is the upper part of one of his arms. Even here, this is pretty close to, I mean, obviously the tops of their heads, their headdresses. Well, even here, this guy is mostly stable until you get to the bottom part of his legs. The scribe is upright, but there obviously are dynamic details of the falcon and the headdress of the pharaoh, Normer, and of course, one of his arms more so than the other. So it's a mixture, but more stable, I would say, than dynamic. Let's see, cool gray color, texture, modeling, line, balance. I'd say it's roughly balanced. To me, Normer is roughly across the middle. And if you do the line here, these two objects almost cover the same area. But if you don't see it that way, I wouldn't take points off. Top to bottom, I'd say it's the same. To me, it's roughly balanced because there's about equal numbers of or areas covered by the top and the bottom. Okay, we went a little over. I won't do that again any other day. We usually end right on time. So are there any questions now before we about this work of art or the elements we covered? I always stick around after the lecture slides themselves are done each day, each class for any questions anybody has. Anybody have any questions about anything?
On the paper, it says, please attach a critique sheet on the top.
Yeah, I'm going to give you that. Yeah, I don't want to send it too early because people will lose it. That's been my experience.
Okay, yeah.
Resend it. I thank you for bringing that up, though. Yes, I will resend that, or not resend. I will send it out as a PDF so you can attach it electronically, because that's the only way we can grade these is to have that there so that we can then electronically fill in, me and the readers, what you're missing or what you did right and the total points for each section and give you the final grade for each of your papers. So you will get that 1 week before, or at least several days before the due date. And it'll be a PDF. So you will need to, make that part of your total submission. The two should be in the same file. Some people have trouble doing that, and I don't blame them. But if it's at all possible to figure out how to combine the PDF of the cover sheet, which is 1 page, with your paper and put them together as a single file, that is much more efficient and much quicker way to grade your papers. So that's what we request. And I'll give you the instructions on submitting them, the website again. It'll all both be in an email and in the class prior to the due date, which is the 6th week. So you've got 2 more weeks. You should be picking a topic. I would suggest, if you haven't already, you should think of one between now and the next class, so that if you have questions or you have trouble finding the sources of research materials, you'll know ahead of time whether or not that topic would work well, or you can ask me questions about it. As long as, they're relating to the elements of composition. As far as the meaning goes, that's your job to research, of course. And yet I'll read the whole rough draft of any paper that you send me, both sections. Okay, so let's see. Any other questions anybody has about anything we've covered today? All right, we're going to do a lot of interesting slides of ancient Egypt. We're going to get started right at the beginning of class. So I will log you guys on about 3:02, and we'll hopefully be able to end right about 4:15 or maybe 4:16 or something like that, but not quite this late, no later than 4:20, because we don't want to cut any of the slides of ancient Egypt. They are some of the most important and interesting ones for this semester. Okay, one more time, anybody have any other questions about anything from today's lecture? All right, so I look forward to seeing you all on Wednesday. Okay, and then we will resume with ancient Egyptian art. All right, take care, you guys.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.